If you're watching this video, you probably already know about color and its three properties, and you've probably already had some experience using color and even using color in complex ways. So you've been introduced to the concept of color complexity. So this is a review video, and so I'll make it as brief as possible. So I'm going to move along pretty quick, but these are the topics that I want to review with you: color complexity, value, intensity, and hue, which are the three properties of color, all in the context of acrylic paint. Quick review on using an acrylic paint palette. So here at school we've got these plastic trays, but at home you could use any kind of a surface that's concave, maybe even a dinner plate. We want a couple sheets of paper towel that are damp on top of the tray or the plate. So I'm going to dampen my paper towel. And then on top of that, we put a sheet of wax paper. And that's where the acrylic paint goes, on top of the wax paper, like I have here. And as long as that paper towel stays wet, the paint won't dry out. Now remember, we use water to clean brushes. And you can use water to thin acrylic, but even better is using medium. And we usually use matte medium here at school. It doesn't have a gloss, and it looks white in the container, but it dries clear. So this is what artists use to thin out acrylic paint. I'll show you why you might want to do that. Let's get into the first property of color, hue. Zoom in a little bit. And now that I'm zoomed in, just a quick review about brushes. It's pretty common to use flat brushes with acrylic paint. Flat brushes are sized in inches. The one on the far left, here's a 1/2 inch, and then here's a 1/4 inch. And then here's a 1/4 inch angle shader, which is quite nice. See how the bristles are cut at an angle? So it's good for getting into tight corners and little spaces. Hue refers to the name of a color. Now when you buy colors, you can buy different variations of a color. Like for instance, here's two different variations of red. One's more of an alizarin and this one's more of a scarlet red, or maybe like a cadmium red. And so of course, when I paint those two reds down on the paper, they look quite different. Right? So there's the what I'm calling like an alizarin, and I'll just grab the other brush here and use it for the cadmium red. So very different, two different hues of red. But then we also know that we can, as artists, mix paint. So what if I take a little bit of this yellow oxide and pull it over to my cadmium type red? Now I have more of a red-orange. So I have a different hue. Red-orange is actually a tertiary color. Okay. Or here's a color called burnt sienna. And so what if I take some of that burnt sienna and mix it into the alizarin? I'm going to change the appearance of the alizarin slightly. So that's one way that you can add a unique quality to your artwork, is by mixing colors, experimenting with colors, mixing them, and you don't have to use them right out of the tube. The second property of color, intensity, refers to the purity of a color. So I'm going to wash out my brush. Remember, when you wash out your brushes with water, dry them after, so that you don't have water mixing into your paint or diluting the paint on your palette. So dry your brush with some paper towel. So if I paint with this blue, which is kind of like an ultramarine blue, right out of the tube, it's pure. Now anything I add to that blue though is going to make it less intense. So for instance, here's where we can do a quick review on what the medium does. So here's some matte medium, squeeze it onto my palette. So now, if I mix a little bit of medium with this blue, the blue is thinner, thereby allowing more of the white of the paper to show, and that actually lowers the intensity of the blue. Another popular way to lower the intensity of a color is to mix it with its color complement. The complementary color of blue is orange, because orange is right across from it on the color wheel. So in my palette, I'll take just a tiny little speck of orange and mix it into some blue. And immediately I can see it's making the blue less intense, more like an earthy gray almost. So I'll just paint that down on the palette so you can see, compare. Look at that, very gray. Wow. So if I don't want it that gray, I would just have to use less orange and more blue. So that's part of mixing colors and part of changing the intensity of colors. You as the artist determine just how de-intensified you want it. Now, of course, another popular way is to mix gray into a color. So maybe you don't want to mix a color's complement. You want to actually, in your palette, mix up some gray with white and black. And then you go and you mix the gray into the color. So now I have like a blue-gray, which technically means it is less intense, less pure. And there it is. Okay, so that's another way to make unique colors, or maybe you want to lower the intensity of a color in order to make colors appear farther away. So a lot of landscape painters do that. Third property of color, value, the lightness and darkness of a color. You've likely done quite a bit of work with value, making value spectrums in graphite and even in paint. So again, this is a review. Let's say I use my blue that's right out of the tube right in the middle of the paper, and I paint some down. Okay, so if I want to move to the left, I want it to go darker on the left. Well then, in my palette, I just carefully take a tiny little bit of black, move it into a section of my palette, and then add a little bit of blue. And we don't need a lot of black because black's a pretty powerful color. And immediately I can see as I paint it down on my paper, it makes a darker blue. Another use of the medium, remember, is to make your viscous, sticky acrylic paint just brush a little bit smoother, like come off the brush and move on the paper a little bit nicer, like not so, it won't be so sticky. So remember that you can mix your medium into your paint on your palette before you apply it to your paper or canvas or board or whatever. Okay, so yeah, the more black I add, obviously the darker my blue is going to become. And so that's one way we can change the value of a color, by making it darker, which means we're shading. Now what about tinting? Tinting means make it lighter. So I'm washing out my brush because I don't want to mix any black into my lighter blues here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully grab a little bit of white, move it over here to this section of the palette, a little speck of blue to make a lighter blue. And again, it's all about ratio. So like the more white I add, obviously the lighter the blue will become. So if I want just a little bit lighter, I would add just a tiny bit of white. And then if I was actually doing like a value spectrum, I would progressively add more and more white until I was painting with maybe almost pure white that's just maybe stained with blue. Oh, see that? My brush is dirty. So sometimes you have to, if you want to achieve a really light value, you got to clean your brush with water, dry it, and then create the desired value on your paper so that your brush isn't contaminated with any paint. So there's a super, super light value of blue. So light it almost looks white. Okay, so there's a spectrum of blue ranging from dark to light. Now keep in mind, we did not change the hue. That's all ultramarine blue, just in different values. Fourth and final topic I want to cover, color complexity. And that comes down to layering colors. So I should have done this at the beginning of the video, and it would have dried in the time I was talking. But look, I'm just going to lay down like an undercolor of burnt sienna. Okay. And maybe while that's drying, I'll just remind you that sometimes you always have some kind of image drawn on your paper. Okay, so say this is my image that I have drawn on my paper, like that's my composition, and I want to maybe do an underpainting all in one color. I just want to stain the paper. So that's a common thing for artists to do. They sometimes, even before establishing the values, they'll just thin out some acrylic paint in a particular color, like I'm doing now with medium, and just stain the whole paper. So in other words, they don't want to paint on top of white paper or white canvas. So they stain the entire surface of their artwork, but they're being careful to control the opacity of the of this stain, of this undercolor, so as to not lose the actual drawing. And then once that's dry, they would paint on top of that. And sometimes they might first do an underpainting all in one color. So like a monochromatic underpainting just in one color to establish all the correct values. And then on top of that, put their top colors on. Other artists maybe would just start working right on top of their underpainting with the actual colors from their color scheme, but in the correct values. So this is dry. Acrylic paint dries fast. So to create color complexity, and this is in any color medium, by the way, acrylic paint, marker, color pencil, pastel. But just a reminder that when you use an undercolor and you allow the undercolor to show through, that's one way to create really rich and complex hues. So consider doing that. Consider using undercolors and then brushing your top colors on top, but in such a way that the undercolor can show through. So you're not just working right on the white of the paper. Okay, and again, that concept is applicable to all media, all color media. And the value, you know, is irrelevant. I mean, value is important, but what I mean is, regardless of the value I put down on top of this burnt sienna, I can still allow that undercolor, that burnt sienna, to show through. Okay, so that's one way to achieve color complexity. So there's a quick review on acrylic paint. Keep your brushes really clean. Use soapy water to wash them out afterwards, and they'll last a lot longer. Have fun making art with acrylic paint.